David, and thank you to everyone for being here today. Can you hear me okay? Great. So like David said, my name is Jessie Brunner. I'm the program manager at the Handa Center for Human Rights and International Justice at Stanford University. And it is my distinguished honor to be able to present this research to you today on getting to good human trafficking data, understanding the landscape of human trafficking data collection in ASEAN, and promoting promising practices both from government and civil society. So I think it's important when we're talking about human trafficking data to start from the question of, well, what are human trafficking data? I think His Excellency Travella sort of raised this question in his remarks. I think oftentimes when we think about human trafficking data, we think about some of these numbers up here. There are 40.3 million people currently in a situation of human trafficking around the globe. That's the latest global estimate on modern slavery that was released this last year as a collaboration between Walk Free Foundation, which is an Australian-based anti-trafficking organization, and the International Labour Organization. We also hear that about 75% of those victims are women and girls. We often hear the statistic that human trafficking, as the second or third largest illicit industry, generates about $150 billion a year in profits for traffickers. And these numbers are incredibly important for advocacy purposes. They draw much needed attention to this issue. But it's a very difficult starting place when we're thinking about actually tailoring policies and making change on the ground. Moreover, these are estimates. These estimates, though rooted in real hard data, are statistically generated, meaning we take what we know about trafficking and we extrapolate it out onto the global population, which, like I said, they are using good statistical methods and using real data, but obviously we know that we're only seeing a small portion of this population in our sample because it is a hidden population. And so I'm really concerned with how do we sort of zoom in on these numbers and think about what data are being generated on the ground day to day. Because I think that's where we can really start with tailoring policies and making change on this issue. It's really difficult to do that at this large scale. Moreover, I would argue that the movement has generally been overly focused on the issue of prevalence. And this is actually a mistake that I myself made in my initial research that David mentioned. I was very focused on, oh, is it too loud now? It's okay. I'm very loud. This was sort of not a mistake that I made, but I was hyper-focused as well on the issue of prevalence, because that's what I think about when I think about human trafficking data, and I think that's what a lot of us think about. And obviously prevalence is important, but when we're talking about a number like 40.3 million people, we're really not going to have a good idea if that number is going up or down. And if it is going up or down, what is that actually telling us? Maybe we're just getting better at counting. Maybe we're getting better at finding victims as opposed to the problem growing. And so, like I said, I wanted to sort of zoom in and think about what else could we mean by data. And that sort of requires asking the question of why do we even need data in the first place? Why do we care? So you can't really see the arrows, but there's little hidden arrows in there. So data are sort of the raw bits of knowledge, right? We start with data. From there, we do analysis on those data. That gives us information, which we then consume, and that leads to knowledge. And from there, we inform our anti-trafficking policies and interventions. And like I said, it's very hard to do that with these large numbers. So what we need are much more granular, localized data. So instead of counting cases, I want to talk about two very important questions, which are the why and the how of human trafficking. As one of my sources told me, we're sitting on a gold mine, but it's collecting dust in file cabinets, meaning we have a lot of data that are not being used in terms of informing policy. So what are some of those questions that we can answer with good data? I put a selection of things that came up in conversations or that I've thought about up here. Good data can tell us how to make awareness-raising campaigns more effective, or why a given industry is more ripe for exploitation linked to forced labor. Data can tell us how the movement, the anti-trafficking movement that we're all engaged in, can better evaluate the quality of services that it's offering to survivors. It can tell us how to better train community workers to lead effective interventions. It can tell us about the experience of a survivor post-trafficking. It can tell us what percentage of survivors are able to access holistic services in a given jurisdiction. What's the average amount of restitution that a survivor might receive in a given jurisdiction? And how does that change across geographies? How are different regions performing when it comes to trafficking cases even reaching the courts? What might be common relationships that we see between traffickers and their victims? But most importantly, a piece that I think we're really missing is how are we doing as a movement, as measuring our efficacy, and we need data to do that as well, and evaluate the impact of the interventions that we've done so far. And in order to begin to answer these questions, particularly on a regional level, we need to be able to have data that can be combined, that can be aggregated, so that we can look for trends and understand patterns. So I want to step back a little bit and sort of take a landscape analysis of where we are as a movement, as the anti-trafficking movement, where we are on the question of data. So obviously, in the recent years, the large-scale digitization of data combined with advancements in computer processing, as well as data science and emerging technologies, has allowed us to apply these new applications to the question of using data to understand the problem of human trafficking. For example, there's an organization in San Francisco called Thorn that has used machine learning algorithms that they've trained on publicly available data on the dark web, and they've been able to use those algorithms to identify posts from underage victims, so CSEC, or commercial sexual exploitation of children, to be able to identify posts just based on the types of language that they use, or common emojis, or characters, or the way they capitalize words or don't. So these are things where computers can learn to detect patterns and say, we think that that was posted by an underage victim, for example. Another organization has created a forced labor risk determination based both on publicly held and private data that they've been able to aggregate, that then gives a risk index to private companies who might want to understand the potential incidents of forced labor in their supply chains. So these kinds of examples are obviously exciting and gripping and compelling, and I certainly think that they should be continued. But this is not the everyday work of most of us in the anti-trafficking movement. And I think where we equally need to be investing our energy and time and resources are in building up the fundamental infrastructure to support better data collection, as well as skills training for those that are really doing this work on the front lines, particularly in ASEAN countries, as I focused on in my research. This is how the movement will get to higher quality, more localized data that we can then use to implement better policies. So again, a lot of these issues that I'm talking about are in no way unique to Southeast Asia. These are things that I've seen at the international level in the United States, in Europe, and all over areas that I've been able to do research on. So what we do not have as a movement, like I said, is access to good ethical data. And I want to kind of draw out what I mean by that. So there are several components that I would put under the category of good ethical data. The first is that data are valid, meaning that they truthfully reflect what they aim to describe. So this comes in when we're thinking about what data points we're going to collect. At any organization, when we're designing an intake form or some kind of data system, we have to decide what data do we think are important. And so this is where validity comes in. They need to be accurate, meaning they truthfully reflect whatever they aim to describe. So for example, if someone gives you their age based on their actual birthday, that would be an accurate reflection of their age, like I said, but I couldn't just look at you and give you an accurate sense of how old you are. I might be able to guess, but it's not going to necessarily be accurate. Data need to be relevant, meaning only information that is applicable and necessary should be collected. I talk in the guidelines about the policy of data minimization, meaning not collecting information that isn't actually being used for analysis, because then it just leads to a liability of sort of holding information that you're not using. Good data are reliable, meaning that data fields are clearly defined, lending consistency and fidelity to the information. This is going to be a very important point when it comes to being able to aggregate or standardize data. And another thing I speak about in the guidelines that you all have is the importance of having a data dictionary for any data that is being collected. That's just a document that outlines what data you have, how do you define a data field. You know, your organization might put date of birth in a different way than another organization, and that all needs to be laid out very clearly so that we can then compare the data. Good data are impartial, meaning they should be collected in a way that is objective and transparent in its methods while acknowledging any limitations or biases. So we all have biases, and there's always going to be methodological limitations to the work we do, especially in an emergent setting, which is often the case for those that are working in the anti-trafficking field. But we have to try as much as possible to compensate for that by being honest about it and acknowledging it in our data. Good data are accessible, meaning data and information on how they were generated should be easily available to key stakeholders, both within and outside the organization. You have probably heard of the concept of metadata. That's essentially data about data. And so when we're thinking about data collection, we need to have all that information on sort of how it was collected, by whom, when, why, connected to that data so that we can always understand it when it's analyzed at a later time. Data needs to be timely, so the utility and validity of data changes over time, so it's best to process it quickly for good decision making. Real-time data can be incredibly valuable, again, in emergent situations, and we can use that to build over time to detect trends. Lastly, good ethical data are responsible. This is a very important point. We have a duty to ensure that people's rights to privacy and security of their information with regard to collection, analysis, storage, presentation, and reuse of data. Whenever possible, we should strive for transparency and openness, but we always need to keep this in mind. And lastly, good data are empowering, meaning they promote stakeholders to have access to the necessary tools, context, knowledge, and skills to make use of the data in with specific objectives in mind. So again, I want to emphasize that when I started out doing this research, I had a meeting in Washington, D.C. with the Department of Health and Human Services, who is also undertaking a very similar study across the U.S. government, trying to identify all the agencies that are collecting data on human trafficking, how it's collected, for what purposes, etc. This is a 5-year study. They're working on this for 5 years. They're in the second to last year now. And when I went in to meet with them to tell them about what I was doing in the context of Southeast Asia, they were 4 years in and they wanted to know what I had found because they were still struggling. That just gives you a sense of how challenging this is, but it's something that we all are dedicated to and are doing together, and we'll all stand to benefit from it as more countries and more regions aim to do this. Which brings me to my research and why I'm speaking with you today and what I've been up to for the last 9 months. This really started out, again, David mentioned the 2015 study. I remember speaking to one of the large development implementing partners that works here in Southeast Asia. And when I was interviewing them about what kinds of anti-trafficking programs they were doing, the woman I spoke to, she told me, well, we're not doing anything with data because we're really focused on the 3 Ps, prevention, protection, and prosecution. And I just thought to myself, but data are so central to all of those, right? And I was frustrated and a little bit heartbroken when she said that to me. And that was sort of my motivation for wanting to continue this research, because I was like, this is someone who's implementing million-dollar projects being, given by donor governments around the world, and not sort of realizing the value and importance of data so central to all of those questions. So I really wanted to bring it down to the practical everyday level, and that started with my own sort of need finding and landscape assessment. So my goals for the work were to understand, okay, so what are the processes? How are data collected? How are data shared? How are data used in day-to-day work? So in order to do that, I started the project in July. It's been a 9-month project, and I've spent about 10 weeks total doing field work. I've interviewed over 75 civil society organizations and government agencies across the 4 ASEAN member states that David mentioned: Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Again, asking through semi-structured interviews. Speaking of methodology, I'll share mine with you all. through semi-structured interviews, including questions like some of these up on the board, just trying to understand how they view data and how data is used. I have the benefit of working with local researchers in each of these contexts who both help me understand the environment as well as provide interpretation as needed. And the objectives of this work were two deliverables. One are the guidelines that you have all in front of you. This is meant to be a very practical sort of day-to-day resource, and what I consider actually to be the most important piece, because I think this, I hope this is how we'll begin to get at that better, more granular, localized data, is by having civil society organizations and frontline practitioners across government implementing some of the suggestions on standardization therein. These include standardization around policies on data ethics, data systems and databases, data storage, data security, data sharing, data analysis and interpretation, and data presentation and visualization. The other piece is a white paper, which you will all receive in the coming weeks. It's currently being published. And that is more looking at, like I said, promising practices in the region, as well as identifying common challenges so that we can try to overcome those together. And that, like I said, that'll be coming out soon. So why is this particularly important right now? So as His Excellency mentioned earlier this morning, ASEAN has ratified the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, which came into effect last year. ACTIP has several stipulations relevant to data collection, both on exchanging and sharing information, conducting research. The associated ASEAN Plan of Action very clearly has language calling on member states to develop national data collection systems in relation to trafficking in persons and methods of exchange of such data between and among ASEAN member states with a view to developing a regional database for trafficking in persons. So obviously, I was very happy to see this included in ACTIP, and I think it shows a lot of foresight on behalf of ASEAN. And the first question in my mind was, great, so we're going to have a regional database. What's going to go inside? What kind of data do we want to collect? And like I said, these were the very same questions I was trying to understand at the grassroots level across the organizations I was working with. And so before we can get to envisioning what such a regional database might look like, we really do need to understand the existing data systems that are out there across the region. So I'll start with the common challenges, because I think it's nice to end on promising practices and end on a good note, because there's a lot of exciting things happening. So when I was asking folks kind of what their biggest pain points were when it came to data collection, things that I heard commonly were lack of capacity building or technical support to implement data systems. Quote, we don't have the technical support we need. Insufficient access to appropriate technology. Quote, there are digital systems and offices without computers. Development partners uninterested in supporting core funding. Quote, there's no money for updates and trainings after a project runs out. Shortage of human resources to support this work. Quote, nobody wants to do this kind of job. Educational approaches that support rote learning more than analytical thinking skills that are central to effective data analysis, and lack of curriculum on computer literacy. Quote, we just aren't taught to think this way. I would argue that some of these reflections are actually symptoms of some of the bigger systemic challenges that I think are faced by the movement, which are as follows. So the benefits of digital data are not being fully realized. So like I said at the beginning, we're in a moment in time where there's a lot of new technologies and data analytics that we could take advantage of, but I think we have a little ways to go before we get there. In a lot of contexts, data is still being collected on paper, in forms that are being filed in cabinets. Sometimes they are being digitized into Excel spreadsheets, and in some cases sort of specialized created data systems, but that is, the latter is certainly not the norm. And even in cases where they have been digitized, I heard countless reports of folks saying, when it comes time to do any kind of reporting, we're manually counting cases, or we're manually tabulating data. And when you're doing that kind of work, by hand, it's really impossible to get at those questions that I talked about initially, to start to look for trends. There's just no way the human brain can keep that much information at one time to be able to look for those patterns. In the quote, in the words of one of my sources, the challenge is we have no good data collection system in place, and that's why we have no clear picture of the problem of human trafficking. The data that we collect is to produce reports rather than understand the picture of TIP as a whole. And I think this points to a larger problem, like I said, where a lot of the data systems that I did observe were designed for very clear reporting purposes, whether that was a ministry or a government agency reporting to the central government level, or whether that was a civil society organization reporting to its donors and supporters. Like, these systems were set up for that function as opposed to making a system that helps an entity answer its organizational objectives or answer the questions that they have about why they're collecting that data. What can that data tell us about how we're doing our jobs? Because of that, data collection and all of the related functions is seen as sort of a drag on time. A lot of people feel like, oh, this is tedious, I'm spending so much time doing data entry, because they're putting all the energy of putting data in, but they're not getting any of the benefit of pulling data out. The people that are encoding, spending hours encoding forms into databases are not being empowered to then extract that data and turn it into knowledge. Like I said at the beginning, turn it into knowledge that can then be used to inform policy. So what we really need to see is more of that. Another significant challenge was lack of infrastructure or technical support on data security. So there is a strong awareness around the issues of privacy that I mentioned earlier. I heard that in almost all my interviews, people speaking about confidentiality and privacy, and that is wonderful and incredibly important. But the systems aren't necessarily in place to sort of operationalize that norm and put in the actual protections that secure data. This is both an ethical and a legal issue, and it's going to increasingly become a legal issue. So the ethical piece is sort of self-explanatory, right? We wouldn't want our personal data out there for the world. If I asked you to give me your unlocked cell phone, I think you'd probably be pretty reticent to do that, right? So I think we can understand the ethical piece. The legal piece, like I said, everyone is functioning in a different jurisdiction that has different laws around privacy and data, and so that's something that needs to be investigated at the local level. But increasingly, this is going to become an international issue that's going to be more and more regulated from the perspective of international law. Some of you may have heard the European Union is about to release new general data protection guidelines, which has been getting a lot of news because suddenly big companies and others who amass a lot of personal data have to be aware of how they protect that data. Obviously, this is an issue that has been in the newspapers a lot. I don't know if it's being talked about as much here as back home because I live about 2 miles from the Facebook headquarters, but Facebook lost $60 billion in a day this week because of issues around data privacy and protection. In our case, we don't have the privilege of being able to fail because we would be failing the very people that we aim to serve, and we need to protect our own sustainability as a movement by ensuring that that kind of data is protected and overcoming any reputational costs that could come about from unsecured data. Some of the things I observed quite frequently across the board were just sort of lack of awareness on how data are stored or backed up. Obviously, backup is also an important piece. We don't want to lose information. The sharing of account information across users. So often if people were using sort of web-based or digital systems, they're often sharing accounts, which can make it challenging for accountability purposes. Lack of awareness around encryption as a tool for data security, or lack of access to the software needed to do that. I would often see like Wi-Fi information written in public places, the network or the login information, which is something that needs to be protected as well. Or folks giving me testimony about websites being down or hacked, which I think points to one of the bigger challenges around data security, which is that a lot of the challenges around data security happen at a very sort of small personal level. It's less about having like a huge system hacked and more about social engineering, meaning how we can be sort of controlled into divulging proprietary information, also known as phishing. So we've probably all gotten emails where we think, this might look suspicious, and someone's asking for my account login information. That's what causes 75% of data breaches, is when people respond to a phishing campaign like that. And so I myself, this happened to me once when I was jet lagged in Indonesia, and I was looking through my email, and I opened one because I was expecting a package, and suddenly I'm like, oh, I almost clicked on that, and I'm someone who works on this issue day to day, and I can still be susceptible to that. So it's something that we all need to be aware of. But luckily there's a lot of small, quick, easy solutions, some of which are included in the guidelines to help us deal with that. The third big issue I observed was that databases are often viewed as an outcome as opposed to a tool or an output that gets us to an outcome. In the words of one of my sources, setting up systems that can't be sustained is like me buying a Porsche and not maintaining it. I saw a lot of examples of databases that were set up, and a lot of money and a lot of time, a lot of energy went into that, and then they later just evaporated for various reasons. Sometimes it came as part of a specific project where the database was linked to a certain project, and not a lot of thought was put into how that database could potentially be used for other purposes beyond the project, and so it just sort of ended with the project. Not enough landscape analysis was done, so sometimes we have a tendency on issues of data or tech to bring in sort of really high-level experts who have this technical background, but they don't really understand the day-to-day work that you all are doing, that we all in the movement are doing, to be able to create systems that are actually usable and sustainable. I heard about systems being designed that were web-based without consideration for internet that might not be reliable, for example. So that's another big challenge. Considerations were not made for costs associated with updates to technology, critical patches, particularly when using even donated services. That's another problem, is a lot of times you'll have a big company like a Microsoft, which will very generously come in and donate technology, but that's not sustainable if they're not also going to donate all the updates and patches that we need to keep that functioning over time. Another challenge was just insufficient investment in buy-in across an organization. So a functioning data system obviously needs to be used by everyone across the board, from caseworkers at the front lines up to the minister level or executive director level of an organization. All need to be able to use a data system to have it work. And that requires doing a landscape analysis with all the different levels, which is why in my meetings I tried to meet with folks at various levels in an organization to understand the myriad ways that they use systems and use data in their work, because that's going to vary significantly across the board. A social worker, for example, might use their data system to track their progress on a specific client, whereas their manager might use the same data system to track how that social worker is performing in their duties, right? So we need to have an idea of all the different ways that people might need to use data. And this is one where I was thinking about designing a regional database for ASEAN, which is why I'm thinking about it a lot, to ensure that we have a database that itself is a tool to get us to better outcomes in combating trafficking. And then lastly, the task forces are not being realized to their full potential in terms of acting as data hubs. So all of the 4 countries that are included in this research have a national task force for counter-trafficking purposes, and they're all extremely robust with wide participation across government from the various ministries that should be involved and agencies, as well as civil society representatives, which is great, and it's wonderful that these bodies exist, and they have so much potential in terms of helping us standardize and align data practices. But unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they're not receiving the guidance or resources that they need from the central government in order to create policies on, say, data governance and data security, for example. This is an area where we could consider participation from, say, national statistics agencies. That was something I tried to meet with some of those folks and wasn't able to. But it's something I hope to do in the future, is thinking about how can we engage national statistics agencies whose job it is to think about data collection for a country day in and day out on the work of anti-trafficking. Another challenge for the task forces is that they're often not sufficiently funded. A lot of times their work is just sort of in addition to all the work that they're doing anyways, and so they don't have the resources that they need to have regular and productive convenings with broad participation. Sometimes there's issues of trust between the various members, not wanting to share data with each other because they feel that someone might use that data wrong, or for whatever reason they have proprietary methods for collecting data. And then another challenge is just sort of perceived hierarchies across the various agencies involved, inhibiting productive collaboration. And so that point about collaboration, I think, is one that I definitely want to emphasize. Like I said, we need to be cautious when it comes to sharing data about confidentiality and privacy, but I don't think as a movement we talk enough about the benefits of sharing data, which include getting to a more robust picture about the scale, scope, and nature of the problem of human trafficking, making progress in efforts to deduplicate data. This is going to be a huge one, especially when it comes to prevalence and counting numbers. Another big one is limiting re-traumatization amongst survivors. Every time someone goes, say from the police into the courts, into social services, and they're re-interviewed, and constantly having to revisit the trauma that they've experienced. By sharing data, we can try to limit that. It also creates opportunities for specialization. Obviously, we all have different knowledge bases and expertise that we can bring to the table, as well as we can learn from scrutiny of our work. I've learned tremendously from allowing folks to review my work and give me feedback, sometimes both positive and negative, that then I can incorporate to make changes. So that's another piece I wanted to emphasize. So like I said, I wanted to really focus on giving a practical, some practical ideas for how to support overcoming some of these challenges and getting to higher quality data in the field. These 7 principles are outlined in the guidelines that you have, and I've sort of already covered why we need them, but I'll just read through them real quick. Human trafficking data can mean many things. So again, it's not just prevalence, it's not just M&E. What does it mean to your organization? Not all data are created equal. So again, having good data as opposed to just more data. Really wanting to share the message of empowerment with folks, that they are a central character in their organization's data story. We all have a really critical role to play when it comes to data collection. We're all in this movement for a reason, and I think if we can really share that message around empowering folks to understand that data is something that can lead to prevention, which is, I think, where we're all trying to get to. Being a critical creator and consumer of data, this is an important one. I think sometimes there's a tendency, when we see something presented as a statistic or in a compelling visualization, we believe it because it looks compelling, but we're not always given enough information to really understand that data. So information on the source of the data, and did the person promulgating that have expertise that allows them to do so? What are potential biases of the presenter, whether intentional or not? Or our biases as a data consumer. When I read data, sometimes I want to agree with it, and so I find myself reading it in a certain way. Data should be seen as an asset, not a burden. I sort of talked about this already. Digital data bring meaningful opportunities, but also challenges. So again, being aware of the potential benefits of digital data in terms of it being easier to collect and store, transfer, analyze. They don't take up physical space in the same way that paper files do, though they do live on physical servers. And taking advantage of emerging technologies to be able to analyze that data, but also being aware of the challenges, again, around security and not being able to protect that data. One of my colleagues at Stanford has a really good analogy for this. She talks about data as water. So traditionally we're used to data in the form of water, or ice, so like solid or liquid form, which we can contain. We know we can hold it in a glass or in a container. But digital data are more like steam. Once they've changed into that form, they're much less easy to control, and we need to know how it's going to spread and how we're going to be able to control that proliferation. And the last point is that collaboration is key, but it requires trust and care, which I talked a bit about already. So that brings us to promising practices. So I'll start sort of broadly at the international level and then zoom in to ASEAN specifically. I just wanted to share a couple initiatives that are happening that touch on Southeast Asia, but also have a global scale. One is the work of the International Organization for Migration, or IOM, which has recently launched the Counter-Trafficking Data Collaborative. This is an online repository of data from IOM, as well as Polaris Project, which is a US-based anti-trafficking organization that you may be aware of because they were sort of the first organization to set up hotlines, and they've done that all over the world, including in some countries in Southeast Asia, hotlines for reporting trafficking, as well as data from Liberty Asia, and I'll speak more about them in a moment. So they now hold a data set of 80,000 cases of trafficking, half of which have been anonymized and aggregated and are available for download and analysis. So this is one exciting way where we can think about being able to actually begin to use data to understand trends. And I just wanted to mention, IOM has really been a leader on issues of data security and privacy and some of these issues that I mentioned early on. They've been talking about this for over a decade, and so there's a lot of great resources that they have on these issues that everyone should consult. Liberty Asia is a Hong Kong-based anti-trafficking organization. They've launched something called the Victim Case Management System, or VCMS. They've implemented this system in about 30 anti-trafficking organizations, mostly in Southeast Asia and some in East Africa, where they're basically using the same system. Everyone has their own unique access and login, but it's all feeding data into the same system, which automatically means we can deduplicate, we can compare, we can share data across partners that are using the system, and it's been implemented free to the partners through a grant from the Counter-Trafficking Office of the State Department. They recently added a feature to allow for automatic GPS mapping, so people, instead of putting location information, typing it in manually, people can just drop pins on maps. If they don't know exactly where something happened, they can just look at a map and drop a pin, and then that information is fed into data on routes, trafficking routes. And this is built on a Salesforce platform. Salesforce is a very large relational database company, again based in San Francisco, that has immense resources when it comes to security. So it benefits from that as well. So now, looking specifically at the 4 countries that I mentioned, I want to start in Cambodia, which they recently released a set of victim identification standards that are being implemented across the various 27 members of the NCCT, the National Committee for Counter-Trafficking there. This has been many years in progress, creating a common set of standards for victim identification, which is obviously a critical component to having good data, right? We need to agree on who a victim is before we can start to agree on the data that we're collecting about them or about their case. So the Deputy Prime Minister, who leads the NCCT, specifically said that they did this in an effort to have a more coordinated approach to the problem. The guidelines offer both a short form and a long form. So the short form can be completed very quickly by a non-expert to sort of look for red flags of cases of trafficking, whereas the long form is to be completed by those who have been trained on the system to identify victims specifically. And they've done several trainings across the country on this. The guidelines also establish very clear workflows for a case, which is an important piece, I think, of data systems that isn't always talked about. And that basically just means like, okay, so someone finds out about a case of trafficking. Who do they tell? What do they do immediately? And having a very clear plan for how a case moves through any government system. They have really great language in there on the issues of safety and privacy and confidentiality that I mentioned, as well as things like informed consent and being reactive to potential trauma experienced by the survivor, so trauma-informed care. Like I said, they've made a significant effort to socialize these norms across the country. They're being implemented by all the ministries that are involved, as well as civil society. So I saw a lot of examples of NGOs that were using the victim identification standards set by the government, which is not typically the case. So that was really encouraging. Here in Indonesia, I want to talk about the Satu Data, or the One Data policy, which basically encapsulates the very thing that we're trying to do in the anti-trafficking field, but just generally across the government. So this effort started about 5 years ago, and Indonesia really put a lot of weight on enhancing accountability and comparability and interoperability of government data. I know Ibu Dina is going to talk about interoperability, so I'll leave that to her. We're awaiting now a presidential decree on this topic that's going to help with the issues of overlapping data sets, lack of data quality, and difficulty in data sharing across the government. There's some really exciting things to expect from this decree. It's going to set official standards for the production of data to allow for interoperability. It's going to mandate that data are released along with their metadata related to how and why they were collected, like I said. It appoints specific delegates in every government agency to act as data mentors or wali data, or data custodians, folks that can lead on capacity building and quality assurance. And I saw a lot of promising examples of how this policy is already being applied in the anti-trafficking movement. So at the Ministry of Women's Empowerment and Child Protection, they have a very impressive data center where they have a data system called Symphony that's collecting data from disparate regions across the country, specifically on issues of violence against women or sexual violence, and trafficking is reported as a component thereof. This is a web-based system. It's populated in real time. I saw it populating on a big wall-sized screen. And I also, when I visited Batam, I actually saw how the local office there in Batam of the KPPA was inputting data straight into the system, which is another piece of the research I didn't mention. I also visited outside the capitals to understand how data was moving between regions and local levels into the capital. Also, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or Kemlu, recently launched their new Service and Protection portal for Indonesians overseas. This is a really exciting initiative that is a partnership with seven relevant government ministries to ensure that data on Indonesian workers abroad is all being put into the same database, so the various ministries are sharing a data system. That's also being fed with information from their e-protection and safe travel applications, which are opportunities for Indonesian nationals to self-report before they go abroad. They can register into these systems. Safe travel is for tourism, and e-protection is for migrant workers. So that their data is there. They can have an app on their smartphone if they have a smartphone available that includes a panic button should they get into a situation. And I'm told that works even while they're abroad and not using an Indonesian SIM. As well as helpful information if they're just a traveler, information on tourist sites and things that they can do while they're abroad if it's not as a migrant worker. Looking to the Philippines. Missing one of my pages. I'll have to do that one by heart. So the Philippines has a really robust anti-trafficking law. They were really at the vanguard of passing legislation criminalizing trafficking in 2003. This law very clearly stipulates all the roles of the various ministries that are involved in anti-trafficking efforts, which I think feeds into my point earlier about sort of the importance of systems, and spelling things out, having things written on paper really holds us to account and ensures that things are approached holistically. So again, this law stipulates the roles of the various ministries as well as the makeup of the IACAT, the Interagency Council Against Trafficking. The law was amended about 10 years after it was passed to specifically call for the creation of a database to be used across IACAT. This project is still in progress through a partnership with the APTIP, the Australian Anti-Trafficking Program. But what I actually think is most impressive about the Philippines is the way that they have ensured that the normative pieces and practices are in place before jumping into the technology. Like I said, I came across so many examples where the technology was the first step when it should actually be the last step. Once all the systems are well thought out and designed, and they've really done that in the Philippines at all the local offices. I heard examples of them reporting to the local IACAT, having similar forms and similar templates for how they share data and using those across the board. I think it'll be really important. The executive director at IACAT, Prosecutor Pajarito, has just stepped down as of last month, and so as they're thinking about putting someone new in her role, it'll be very important to ensure that this person also has a vision for really appreciating the importance of good quality data. And then in Thailand, again, the creation of a unified database. So Thailand has recently launched, again, a shared database on trafficking that's used by both the courts, the Attorney General, the Thai National Police, Royal Police, sorry, as well as the Social Ministry, where they're, again, inputting data into a single system that allows for deduplication of cases. So cases are only in there once, and the various ministries have access to their components of the case. This was the result of an incredible effort by a multidisciplinary team, but led specifically by a woman who's just, her commitment to the cause has just been unbelievable. And in her words, she said, we want to put data at the fingertips of those engaged on the front lines of the work in a way that adds value, is reliable and sustainable, so you can depend on your data for decision making. That pretty much encapsulates exactly what my goals in this research are, is to get us to that point as a movement. And so she and her team, over the course of a year, went and visited 11 provinces throughout Thailand, had hundreds of meetings with practitioners to do basically exactly what I was doing for the last 9 months, meeting with folks to understand how they collect data, why they collect data, and then using all of that information to inform the creation of this shared database. Another thing that they did that I think was really thoughtful was engaging a local technical university to design the system, to ensure that it was designed locally by folks that understand the environment, but also now they have partners locally to ensure the sustainability of the platform. And the folks there are really engaged on the issue now, and we're talking about ways of using machine learning to dig into the data and try to understand trends and on an issue that they had never thought about before working on this database, which I think is really, really exciting. The last thing I want to share is just some quotes from folks that I talked to that, for me, are what really encouraged me in thinking about, okay, we can get there, because there's a lot of people who believe in the power of data to help us with this, combat this problem. So I'll read a few of those. If you lobby for change, they always ask for data, so we have to prepare. You don't go to battle without your bullets. We need to use every tool in the toolbox to tackle the issue of trafficking, and by not having good data, we are not using a critical tool. We feel what's really needed is constant guidance and collective checking on each other that good data is a regular part of our work. We want everything at our fingertips, and we want it to be valid, reliable, and sustainable, so we can depend on data for decision making. So that just gives you a sort of a sampling of the different kinds of things that I heard. So moving forward, again, in the forthcoming report that you'll be receiving, I've laid out policy recommendations for the various stakeholders whose efforts will be important to this. So that's donors, civil society organizations, governments, and ASEAN as a body. So I think we all have a really, really critical role to play in ensuring that we get to better data around specifically these issues of interoperability, collaboration, and just an openness to learning, to knowing what works. And I just want to close with this quote from the former U.S. ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, who I had the extreme privilege of meeting recently. She said, "We cannot change what we cannot see. But when we are able to identify problems at a local level, we empower ourselves and our communities to right the scales, and we can make out the bright spots and best practices that can be replicated elsewhere." With that, I just want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank specifically again the British Embassy for their vision and support for this project, especially Rob Campbell-Davis, who is on leave, but I'll see him next week and report back to him on this. All the folks at the Human Rights Resource Center for all the support on the project, Ibu Chuti, Ati, Seth, Olive, Nia, East West Center, my colleagues at the Handa Center, specifically Professor Cohen, Ibu Dina for her support and encouragement throughout the project, all my fellow panelists from the SOMTC, ICHR, ACWC, and WinRock, and just to all the sources who are really doing the frontline work. I learned so much, not only from how they do their day-to-day work, but from their passion for the cause. So, thanks.